Okay, today we're going to talk about the early independent era of three of the larger and many historians argue most important nations in South America and Latin America in general, Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina. So these are the major South American nations that are on the other side of the Andes, largely kind of facing north and east and south in South America. So first we'll start off with Venezuela. We're going to take all of these to about 1889 or so. So we'll start with Venezuela. We have a pretty good map here, a topographic map that shows where Venezuela is and what its coastline looks like. So the Spanish explorers, when they first got to the area, were mostly hoping to find the legendary El Dorado, which was this kind of lost city of gold where buildings were made out of gold and there's gold in the streets everywhere and things like that. So that's what a lot of Spanish explorers were really hoping to find when they were started poking around the area. But instead, they kind of ran into some lakes, and especially the one really big lake. They saw a lot of native huts built on stilts sitting on top of the lake, or the houses just above the lake sitting on stilts. So the Spanish were so impressed with this that they called the area of these native settlements Little Venice, named after the canals in Venice. And so the idea of Little Venice as a kind of reference point to the whole region really stuck, and that's where the name Venezuela comes from. Venezuela is geographically divided into five general different major zones or regions. So if I can get my mouse in here for the arrow, there is a large mountainous range, a part of the Andes Mountains that stretches up into Venezuela, that is up here in the kind of north and east, where this mountain range really dominates this zone. And then there are these central plains called the Llanos, that are largely flatlands, farmlands. So that's a second major zone. And then there's a northern coastline that's very much separated from the plains by another kind of east-west running mountain range. And so this coastal area is very much kind of a strip of land along the coast that's separated by mountains from much of the rest of the country. And that's where the major city, Caracas, that the Spanish would build and becomes the eventual Venezuelan capital city, is located along the coast there. And there's other major cities along that coast as well. There's also a very eastern part of the country out at the Orinoco River Delta, where the river breaks into many tributaries to empty into the Atlantic Ocean on the coastline. And this delta is a very kind of humid region, and that's seen as a fourth major region or zone of the country. And then in the south, there are these kind of highlands where the mountains start to rise and get into the edge of the Amazon rainforest. So that's a fifth major zone. So those are the five kind of major different areas that many historians talk about when they discuss Venezuelan politics and political factions and whatnot. So when Spain started to colonize this northern part of South America, they largely used Venezuela, the colony, as a kind of guard post to station troops and whatnot and put cannons up on hills overlooking the Caribbean Sea in order to control the Caribbean Sea and protect it against any possible invaders or pirates or anyone that might try to do any kind of damage to Spanish shipping coming in and out of the Americas. So it was they built Venezuela largely as a fortress to defend their other investments, and Spain would also use Venezuelan land as a place to basically grow a bunch of food to ship to other larger colonies like New Spain, what is today Mexico, to feed those areas that might have had trouble producing their own food supply. The independence wars against Spain really devastated the country. in the 18 teens and 1820s. Uh, its historians have estimated at least 20% of the pre-war population was killed in those wars. But its revolutionary leaders, the major two, the big one being Simon Bolivar, um, and his lieutenant, who largely stayed in the Venezuelan area, Jose Antonio Paez, they did not really use their new independent status as a Venezuelan country or part of this larger vision of Gran Colombia that Bolivar held. They didn't use that new independent status or the destruction that had been wrought in order to achieve that status as a springboard or an opportunity to build any kind of radical change for the new country. They largely made a lot of promises about ending slavery or ending racial discrimination amongst different groups, but they largely didn't really deliver on those promises. So a lot of those promises will wait to be fulfilled, often much later. There is, especially among the Llanos, the big landowners in the plains, Venezuela devolves into what we have already identified as general Cadillo politics, the politics of individual landowners that have enough money to hire basically private armies, private militias, and become kind of small political parties all by themselves. And they wage political warfare against each other in the decades after independence. So the Caudillos in Venezuela fought each other for political influence and wealth and power and the ability to make national policy, largely to advance their own personal interest in building up even more wealth and power for themselves. Now, probably the most powerful of the caudillos in this era was Paez himself. He was from the Llanos, the plains where most of the big landowners were. So he becomes a leader of those big landowners who call themselves the Llaneros, who come from that central plains region. So he pushed several policies that he thought would further enrich and empower himself and the other landowners that supported him. He pushed the country to kind of move toward more coffee production, and then later toward cacao production after European fads started consuming vast amounts of chocolate. So he also sought what we would today call kind of free trade type policy, to try to get rid of import taxes and whatnot. And one of his biggest policies is to make sure that business contracts are upheld and enforced. So he and his conservative party that he led is largely based in kind of financiers, money lenders for the most part. People have foreign influence from foreign bankers very often. So they become the conservative party under his leadership, and a liberal party will also evolve early to mid 1800s, to the few decades to 10, 20, 30 years after independence was achieved. So the liberals largely coalesced around the planters. People have smaller farms in different regions rather than the money lenders and the giant landowners that Paez was leading. But in general, the liberals and conservatives didn't really have a whole lot of big ideological conflicts. Sometimes they argued over the influence of the Catholic Church, but that was seen as a kind of secondary conflict, and that didn't really cause a lot of major political infighting that might lead to civil wars that we've seen in other Latin American countries that we've talked about already in this course. So Paez is around until about 1848. And the new people on the scene that will come into power in about 48 after Paez fell from power are the Monagas brothers, Jose Tadeo and Jose Gregorio Monagas. So their general policy as leaders of the Liberal Party is to eliminate a lot of private debts in the country that they argued were kind of fraudulent and unfair. So what we would today call like predatory lending. And since they thought that a lot of those contracts that Paez had wanted to defend to the last that those contracts were the source of a lot of that fraud. They want to repeal a lot of the very heavy contract laws to allow for contracts to be disputed, basically. They also took the major step of abolishing slavery in Venezuela, which is one of the major shifts that we've seen throughout Latin America in the 1800s. So Venezuela is one of the earlier countries in Latin America to completely abolish slavery. And they also looked to pass like mineral rights, where they basically said that a private landowner owns the land on the surface, but that any minerals or other valuables or other resources that might be kind of dug down underneath the surface, that the nation owns those. So it's seen as a nationalization of what the brothers called the subsoil rights. And the brothers were also interested in trying to start industrialization and going for the high technology of the time, which was a telegraph, which was basically a phone system based on Morse code, which was much faster communication because it used electricity than writing a letter and then putting it in the mail and hoping that it actually got to wherever it's going a week or two later. So a telegraph was a major leap forward in instantaneous communication. Even though you couldn't talk with voice, you would talk with Morse code. A lot of these policies are fairly controversial and leads to a civil war in 1858 that really knocks the brothers out of power and gives Paez an opportunity to come back into politics and build a new dictatorship, which he finally accomplishes in 1861. So Paez is trying to fight this civil war on the conservative side against the liberals. Eventually the conservatives will lose the civil war to a new group called the Federalists in 1863, and that will take Paez back out of power. The main Federalist leader was named Antonio Guzman Blanco, and he was basically appointed vice president in 1864, right after their final victory over the conservatives. And a little bit later, he overthrew the sitting president and took power for himself in 1870. So he makes himself into president in 1870, just basically by throwing the sitting president in jail and getting rid of him. So Blanco has some new major kind of ideas about government policy, so he's going to keep pushing Venezuela forward in certain directions. So coming out of a civil war, his number one priority is to rebuild the government, rebuild stability and public order, and get foreign trade going again, try to get economic growth, because most foreigners tend to stop sending their boats to war zones because they don't want their property to get destroyed. Pretty sensible decision. Blanco was also very interested in public education, so he stopped the Catholic Church's dominance over the education system in Venezuela, opened up free and compulsory education for children, which means that children up to a certain age have to attend school, and if they don't, they're breaking the law and can be punished. So the public education system was free for the children to attend, but they did have to attend. He also closed a bunch of convents and seminaries attached to the Catholic Church, and gave the responsibility for higher education, and especially religious education, not to the Catholic Church, but built up a whole new public university system. There is some major downsides to a lot of this stuff. Many Venezuelans liked what he is doing for the economy. There is fairly decent economic growth. But they did not like the fact that he seemed to use some fraudulent elections to stay in power. He is reelected twice, basically, in his time. So a lot of Venezuelans liked the economic growth and a lot of the kind of removal of the church's dominant position over major social systems, but really hated the political repression that he was enforcing upon them. So when he went on vacation in 1887 in August, there's a major uprising against him which forces him to resign the next year in 1888, so he's off the scene at that point. And we'll basically stop with Venezuela there, and we'll pick up the rest of Venezuela's story in a later lecture. So that will push us on toward Brazil. So Brazil to 1889 is a very different story in a lot of ways, especially different from Venezuela. Brazil's revolutionary movement was very peaceful in almost every way. There is no giant revolutionary war against the Spanish. The Spanish were fighting in many other places, and Brazil wasn't even a Spanish colony to begin with. It was a Portuguese colony. And Portugal had so many other problems going on, especially in Europe, that when the Brazilian big landowners tried to push for independence, Portugal didn't really have much power to resist it, and they didn't really even much try. So the Brazilian independence movement is largely just kind of a handoff from the King of Portugal, who had been living in Brazil for a while. He basically allowed Brazil to become an independent country and allowed one of his sons to take over that country as the emperor of this new place called Brazil. So the lack of kind of a giant revolutionary war made Brazil one of the kind of most stable Latin American states in the 1820s after this whole revolutionary era ends. There's no major economic destruction. There's no giant loss of life. There's no massive revolutionary army that might try to overthrow the new government. And the monarchy is still pretty stable. I mean, it's even the same family. It's just the son of the Portuguese king is now running the place. So a lot of that stability lasts for several decades. Sugar is its big economic kind of lifeline. So there are other landowners who grow other things to either feed the Brazilian population or to sell on the worldwide market. But for international sales, sugar is the big thing. It's the massively profitable cash crop that Brazil tended to grow in the early 1800s. But that reliance on a sugar-based economy also had a very bad side to it, and that's the fact that you need a whole lot of workers to grow the sugar cane and to hash it out and to refine it. And the Brazilian population just wasn't that large of Portuguese colonists. So the Portuguese colonists had always had labor problems, and they solved that by bringing in African slaves. So African slavery in Brazil is a gigantic thing. Even at independence, historians estimate that over half the population of Brazil at independence were African slaves, and that only there's this tiny little middle class of what we would today call white collar professionals like lawyers and government bureaucrats and teachers and whatnot. And there's very few kind of merchants or money lenders or whatnot in Brazil at independence. So Brazil is economically reliant on sugar, which makes them economically reliant on slavery, and Brazil will be one of the last Latin American countries to eliminate slavery. So it's going to be quite a long road toward that goal. But as I said before, Brazil had declared independence, which was basically just kind of a political handoff from the Portuguese king to his son, Pedro, who, when Brazil was a colony, was known as Dom Pedro, and when it became an independent country, he started being called Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. So he takes up political leadership of the new country and writes up a constitution in 1822. And very quickly after that, they're going to start holding elections. Pedro is basically king, so he runs the executive branch, but there's going to be an elected legislature. So they start having elections, and just like many other places we've talked about, a couple of political parties develop in Brazil to win those elections and try to put their policy ideas forward. The big political split early on is really between a kind of independence party that are kind of people who believe in the independent Brazil project versus the loyalist people who want Brazil to remain or even revert back to being a Portuguese colony. Pedro the First, he likes having his own country under his own name, so he likes having an independent Brazil. But remember, his family relations and everything that he grew up to believe in was largely connected with Portugal, so his foreign policy is largely pro-Portugal, and to help Portugal in its own kind of foreign policy goals around the world. So even though a lot of these pro-Brazilian legislators are getting elected, and there's a lot of pressure for Pedro I to appoint pro-Brazilian type thinkers into his cabinet, his official group of advisors, Pedro I is very resistant to that because he takes a very kind of pro-Portugal stance. And one of his most famous cabinet members was forced to resign within 3 months. So that tells you the extent to which Pedro wasn't willing to put up with a lot of disagreement on some of those central issues. And the voters for the Brazilian kind of independence-minded party are very upset that Pedro's done this, and so there's a lot of public gatherings of Brazilian people starting to demand changes to the constitution or a decentralized government to take some power away from Pedro and put it in hands that they think are more reliable for Brazil's long-term future. But again, he writes a whole new constitution in 1824 to try to quell the protests. And the kind of draft constitution that he decrees in 1824 largely followed a lot of the Brazilian independent party's kind of demands and its ideas. But the big change is that Pedro I also reserved what was known as the Poder Moderador, which means the moderating power, which basically means that the monarch, the emperor, reserves the power to close Congress or to declare new elections when things are going in a direction he thinks is dangerous. So he proclaims that power in this constitution. And also he had the power to hire his own advisors and to fire them whenever he wanted. So the emperor in this constitutional system is pretty powerful. And voting rights under this constitution that he decreed were only given to land-owning males, adult land-owning males. So that meant that the average people out there could not vote. They didn't have a vote in the elections at all. They didn't get a ballot to cast. So you had to be a fairly large landowner to get that voting right in Brazil. And when landowners are the only ones voting, of course they're going to vote for politicians and parties that promise to give them what they want, which is usually more land and power for themselves. A major problem that Pedro has is that some of the Brazilian provinces, I mean, Brazil is a large country, has many provinces, some of them are so angry at this constitution and the inequities in it that they declare independence and try to break away from Brazil to write their own constitutions. And that's largely in the kind of northeastern part of the country along the coastline at Pernambuco. And some of the neighboring provinces to that area also declared independence and tried to break away to form their own country. That very much upset a lot of Pedro and his government, and a lot of the Brazilian independence followers. But they got even more scared when one particular leader of this independence movement, this kind of breakaway revolutionary movement, started promising that if they do form their own country, that they're going to end slavery entirely. And that statement scared a lot of people, not only in the rest of Brazil, but also within their own revolutionary movement, to the point that a lot of the early revolutionaries get afraid of succeeding and getting their own country, because then they might have to end slavery. And remember, these are largely landowners who depend on slavery, so a lot of them just abandoned the cause of independence from Brazil in the first place, and so the revolutionary movement just kind of collapses all by itself. Pedro himself was also, responsible for helping to kill off the revolutionary movement. He didn't have enough troops by himself and under his own government, so he basically paid a whole bunch of foreign mercenaries to come to the area and run much of his conflicts against the revolutionaries. And for Pedro to bring in especially French mercenaries was seen as a very dangerous thing because France had invaded and conquered Portugal in the previous couple of decades, so that memory was fairly fresh. And for him to invite French mercenaries into his country to do his bidding seemed like a very big risk to a lot of people at the time. But Portugal had very good relations with the British Empire, and therefore Brazil did too. And here's a map of the British Empire all over the world. The British Empire in the 1820s was the biggest and most dominant empire in the world, and would even grow to be more dominant throughout much of the rest of the 1800s. So Britain is really the kind of superpower, for lack of a better term, of the 1800s. They are the most powerful country in the world. And they had very close relations with Portugal because they had both united to attack France earlier in the 1800s. So Britain has pretty close relations with Brazil, and Pedro I has good relationships with the British leaders. So the British will actually help develop Brazil's economy, and the British government will basically demand that other countries respect Brazil's independence. So the British Empire was willing to back Brazil as an independent entity, and there are some secret deals that are later revealed through historical scholarship, where Brazil paid for that favor by basically giving a bunch of money over to Britain to basically buy that support. The British had also ended slavery throughout their empire in 1830, and were pushing on Pedro I and the Brazilian government to also end their slave trade. But the Brazilian government was very resistant to that idea because they knew how much they relied on slaves to produce the sugar that they sold internationally, and was still a central piece of their overall national economy. The next step in Brazil's development is they have an emergency in their southern kind of area as it gets closer and closer to Argentina. Their southern province, which had historically been known as Rio de la Plata, had tried to break away from Brazil in order to join with a new country that is today known as Argentina. So you can see on the map here that this area in white is really on the border between Argentina and Brazil, and they tried to break away and form an independent country with the intent of joining with what is today known as Argentina. The British kind of intervene in this. Brazil actually fought a war to try to force that province back under Brazilian control, but Brazil lost that war. So they had lost control of the area, basically. And this is when Britain intervened to really negotiate an end result. And Britain, mostly, their goal is to really or Argentina, but to help that area become an independent country, which they succeed in doing, which is called Uruguay. And the British largely did that because the British were being kind of frozen out of a lot of trade in Brazil, especially along the coastline, and same with Argentina. So the British wanted an area kind of in the region that would be open to British influence and traders and economic power coming to the area. So it seems that many historians have argued that Britain mostly negotiated Uruguay's independence from Brazil as a new country in order to have an access point for British traders to get into this eastern part of South America. So that treaty is finished in 1828. And while all this is going on, the sitting king of Portugal, King João VI, died in office. And as that was becoming clear that it was happening, Pedro I in Brazil became absolutely obsessed with getting one of his own daughters to be the next in line for the Portuguese throne. The problem is that a lot of average Brazilians had become kind of sick and tired of Pedro's increasingly absolutist and dictatorial policies, and he seemed to be continuing to go down that path. So in April of 1831, there erupts a huge amount of street protests in different places around the country that forced Pedro to really resign and turn over the throne to his son, who was only 5 years old at that point, who becomes known as Dom Pedro II. And that's one of the problems with monarchies, is that if you suddenly get a kid on the throne, you really don't want a 5-year-old running the country. So ever since ancient times, whenever that's happened, the kind of highest advisors to the king who has just left office, in this case Pedro I, his most trusted advisors get together and they form what they call a Regency Council, which is basically a committee to run the country until this child king grows up and becomes an adult and is mature and responsible enough to actually be trusted to run the country. And some provinces that were not happy with this whole deal took this opportunity of this kind of committee of advisors running the country to push demands for constitutional changes that would give them more authority in their own province, which some provinces really did accomplish. Some others, especially in the Amazon Valley, get so angry that they start basically a civil war where they try to get more and more independence that the central government was not willing to give. So a 10-year civil war broke out that eventually the Brazilian central government won. And after a while, Dom Pedro II kind of grows up. And he's pictured very young in this picture, in this painting. So he took the official throne in 1840 and promised to end all the big political divisions. And he was fairly successful at ending those divisions. He does keep the moderating power, the poder moderador, that was kind of part of the 1824 Constitution that his father had created. But he does allow elections to go on to elect lawmakers, and largely accepted that level of democracy. He largely allowed those elected lawmakers to advise him very closely on how he was going to run the executive branch, which is the branch of government that enforces laws and runs foreign policy and whatnot. So he really allowed the political party leaders, he appointed them to be his highest advisors in the executive branch, and to a pretty large extent they really run the executive branch. But those lawmakers always knew that this emperor, Dom Pedro II, had retained the power to fire them at any time, and also to dissolve the Congress and call for new national elections whenever he wanted. So you do get an emergence of a kind of a conservative and a liberal party, two different political parties by the 1850s, but again they didn't really have very big ideological differences. The big thing that happens in the 1850s is a kind of series of wars that will include the four major countries in kind of eastern South America. Brazil and Argentina are by far the biggest countries in that region of South America, so they largely see each other as kind of political and military rivals for who's going to dominate the South American continent. And in 1852, Argentina is under a dictatorship, and its dictator decided to try to invade eastward into Uruguay and capture that area and make it part of Argentina. That did not work so well because Brazil and Uruguay signed an alliance to fight back, to attack Argentina and force them to retreat. And that Argentine leader is overthrown in Argentina and put into exile in 1852. But a few years later, in 1865, a dictator in another country called Paraguay, which is just a little bit further north, in red on this map, thought that all this had created an opportunity for him to take over some more land. So he sent his troops to the east and the south at the same time to take over as much land as he possibly could. So this ends up being an invasion of Argentina, an attempted invasion of Uruguay, and an invasion of Brazil all at the same time. And this is will become known as the War of the Triple Alliance, because Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil all form an alliance to fight off the Paraguayan invasion. At first, the Paraguayan troops are much better, and they win the early couple years of the war until Brazil can just kind of marshal its massively larger population and resource base than what Paraguay had access to. So Brazil has a huge population, and if you start a draft, they can build a huge army fairly quickly. So its vastly larger resources just kind of overwhelmed the Paraguayan military to the point where Paraguay had to basically surrender in 1870. So the war ruined Paraguay, basically, cemented relations between Brazil and Argentina. And another end result is that Brazil took a lot of influence over Uruguay as basically the savior of Uruguay in fighting off the Paraguayan invasion. The war also made military leaders in Brazil much more kind of prominent in society. They become military heroes, and they will start trying to launch their own political careers or advance what political careers they already had. There's also a big conflict at the end of this war. Pedro II wanted Paraguay's unconditional total surrender, whereas a lot of the liberal lawmakers under him wanted to negotiate with Paraguay. So Pedro dissolved the liberal-controlled cabinet and called for new elections suddenly, which really angered a lot of liberals. And some of those angry liberals went off and started a whole new political party that they call the Republican Party, as a kind of power base to try to protect and defend themselves. Since Brazil had faced a kind of military emergency when Paraguay invaded, the Brazilian army allowed slaves to be enrolled in the Brazilian army. And the slaves fought so well and reliably and honorably during the war that an abolitionist movement starts to grow fairly quickly in Brazil, arguing that slavery should be ended because the slaves have kind of proved themselves to be good patriots and capable of learning and fighting and doing anything that any other European type soldier is capable of doing. So as the abolition movement really gets going and picking up steam, it will start to accomplish big things kind of piece by piece. So here's a slide that gives you a breakdown of the major steps toward ending slavery in Brazil, and you can see, just looking at the timeline, we start in 1850 and go to 1888, so it's a 38-year project. So Brazil had ended the slave trade in 1850. That means that they do not, or it is illegal for Brazilians to import new slaves into the country, but the slaves that are already in the country are still enslaved. A lot of the landowners get very much behind this abolition movement, not because they're especially nice people and they want to, treat all humans equally, but a lot of the landowners saw slavery in Brazil as eventually an economic problem for them. Brazil still has labor shortages, and if you're not importing new slaves, you have to bring in people from somewhere. So a lot of the landowners in Brazil start flying advertisements in foreign countries, trying to convince foreigners to immigrate to Brazil. But it didn't really work because when you have slavery in your country, you know, not many immigrants are going to want to come to that country looking for jobs, because those jobs probably won't be paying very much because you have slavery, which pays nothing. So the landowners were really caught in a bind. They want more labor, but they also don't want to give up their slaves. They want more labor, but they don't want to pay for it, essentially. They don't want to pay very high wages or really any wages at all. So a bunch of the landowners get so angry at this conundrum that they just start arguing to end slavery altogether. But again, the abolition of slavery occurred in steps. The first big abolition law was passed in 1871 that made all children born of slave mothers, made them free. But even if they are free, technically they're children until they're about age 18 or 21 or something like that, depending on what the Brazilian law is at the time. Even though the children are free, the mother is a slave who is owned by probably a landowner. So that landowner has control over dictating what kind of work that child does. But after 1871, it takes quite a while, for the next big step in the movement to occur. And many historians argue that the activists were busy in those years, gathering money, forming organizations, going out and speaking publicly, trying to figure out what kind of propaganda machine they need to get going to accomplish their goals. So we don't get the next step for quite a while, until 1885, when a law is passed that frees all slaves over 60 years old. And just 2 years later, the Brazilian army announced that it was no longer willing to help return runaway slaves to their theoretical slave owner. So the army officers just basically tell the country, you've been using the army to capture slaves and bring them back to whoever their owners are, but the army is not really going to do that anymore. And at that point, that seems to be the kind of final straw that broke down the demand to keep slavery. So the next year, in spring in 1888, the so-called Golden Law frees all slaves in the country. And after Brazil ends slavery, then they suddenly have a big immigration boom, because the workforce is now being paid, so everyone's making better money at least, and that inspires immigrants to come over to what they see as a prosperous economy that has jobs that can pay them fairly well. So you will get in the late 1800s and early 1900s huge amounts of immigrants from Italy, Portugal, Japan, Eastern Europe, and even the Middle East, as we call it today. So Brazil will average somewhere around 70,000 immigrants per year until 1930. So that's over 50 years of just massive immigration year after year. So what's going on with the central government in all these years? There were national elections in 1868, which the Liberal Party won. But Pedro II is so kind of angry at that and doesn't trust these liberal leaders that he refuses to basically formally recognize these liberal leaders as part of his cabinet. So instead, he builds a new cabinet with mostly conservative party members, which the liberals kind of threw up their hands and say, how could you do this, because we won the latest election, how come we're not being appointed to office? And a lot of these kind of liberals go off and form a whole new political party in 1870, which becomes known as the Republican Party. And it was mostly powerful in just a few provinces in Brazil, didn't have much of the national vote, at least until the late 1880s. But they did want some major constitutional changes. They wanted to get rid of the emperor and have an elected president. So it's largely the kind of younger, educated generation of politicians that are pushing these ideas forward. basically you're going to have a boiling over point in 1889. There's another round of elections throughout the country, and the Liberals win again. And once again, Don Pedro II tries to avoid giving them their official positions, so he tries to kind of shut them out. And at this point, the population is getting pretty angry with Pedro II. He's been in office for 40 some odd years, but going on 50 years is quite a long time to stay in power. So when he refuses to allow the Liberals to form the government, basically, that creates a major backlash and calls to overthrow the emperor and even overthrow the whole government and start it from scratch with the new constitution. But it did succeed in 1889. Don Pedro resigns. He abdicated is a fancy word for a king or a monarch resigning and just kind of going off into retirement. But he didn't just go into retirement. The liberal lawmakers forced him to leave Brazil entirely and go back to Portugal and kind of live out the rest of his life there. But even during all this in 1888, 1889, there's very little violence. It's largely just kind of people gathering in mass numbers and making public demands. And since there's not much violence, it's not a civil war or anything. The major landowners in the Central Plains kind of keep their lands, and they keep making profit. So they will continue to be the economically dominant position in Brazil, and they will dominate Brazilian politics still for quite a long while. All right, and in the 1800s, we generally see this kind of shift away from sugar and toward more coffee and eventually cacao. But Brazil remains basically a one-crop economy, which is always very dangerous, because what happens if the worldwide prices for that crop go down? Then you can have waves of foreclosures and all kinds of other economic problems throughout the country. Not to mention social problems of people that get thrown out of work and they're so angry they're going to go out and protest. And coffee becomes a hugely important product for Brazil. It grows to be over half of the Brazilian economy, or at least their exports, by the early 1900s. And it is estimated that Brazil produces about 2/3 of the world coffee production total by the early 1900s. So the idea of coffee and the experience of planting and harvesting coffee would basically take over the Brazilian economy and even their general society. Their social norms are based around the kind of coffee harvest schedule. The problem with growing coffee, though, is that a coffee tree takes years to mature and start, producing the seed. Coffee harvesting and just upkeep of the trees requires a massive amount of labor and a lot of planning, because a coffee tree generally does not mature to the point where it can be harvested for at least 6 years. So a lot of these coffee planters are planting their land in phases in order to always make sure that they have a supply of coffee being harvested. But coffee trees also did a lot of environmental damage. Just like any other crop, if you plant it over and over again, year in and year out, you're going to run into a harvest problem, because the harvest starts shrinking, because the thing that you've planted over and over again, year in and year out, has basically drained the soil of nutrients. A lot of the landowners who feel they have to abandon their coffee fields, they would just try to get some money together and go plant new coffee fields somewhere else, because it was cheaper. So over time, there's a huge amount of abandoned coffee farms all over Brazil. And Brazil's other problem is it just lacked the modern technology of the time, the government-sponsored infrastructure usually, to increase the efficiency and the yield of their agricultural-based export economy. So they do not have telephone lines. They don't have many telegraph lines. They don't have many railroads. It is not an electrified country, which means they cannot just kind of plug in stuff into a wall and expect electricity to get a machine to run. So we'll stop there with Brazil right around 1890 or so, and we'll move into Argentina. So the Spanish colony that originally will grow into Argentina was originally called Rio de la Plata. And again, just like other areas we've talked about, the Spanish pretty much overlooked the area. It didn't seem to have really a whole lot of valuable resources or anything else that the Spanish conquerors were looking for in a colony at the time. If they had been more patient and done more explorations into the interior of Argentina, they would have found some of the best farmlands, the most fertile farmlands in the whole world. But they largely did not try to get out of the main kind of capital city at Buenos Aires. Argentina's economy is also based on agriculture for export, so their big products are really meat and grain. But they had to really watch out on who they sell their meat and grain to, because it's well known that some regions of Argentina are going through tough economic times and trying to transition in their produce. So the independence wars, much like with Brazil, for Argentina didn't really do a whole lot of damage, because most of the fighting in South America between rebels, revolutionaries, and the Spanish government mostly happened along the Andean coastline. So you also get several different kind of political parties that rise up in Argentina, largely defined according to what they want to do with Buenos Aires, the capital city, and which is a province all by itself. So Argentina is also split up into many different provinces. And one party wanted to end Buenos Aires's kind of special status as the capital city and make it more like a provincial capital, where the city leaders can basically run their own economy just in their province. There's another group called Federalists that mostly just want to nationalize Buenos Aires, end its status as an independent province, and make it part of the national government by law. And there's a third party that also call themselves Federalists, but they're mostly just kind of status quo conservatives from the previous era who don't really want to change much of anything. One of the most famous early presidents of Argentina is named Juan Manuel de Rosas, and he goes into office in 1829, so just barely about 9 or 10 years after independence is achieved. So his policies are largely along with the old Cadillo idea. He is a landowner himself. He views landowners as kind of the backbone of the country, so he and his policies are very much in line with the landowners and look to kind of support their power for the long term. So he has good relations with the major landowners and a lot of the elite landowners throughout the country. The problem is that he doesn't have a very good relationship with the general workforce that's out there. So instead of trying to convince that general workforce to support him, he instead built the Mazorca, which was basically a political police force that ran around the country and targeted the president's opponents and really just terrorized them into compliance. And Rosas is deposed in 1852 when he tried using basically dictatorship plans in order to force a lot of his political enemies within Argentina to fall in line behind him. So they largely got together and figured out a way to arrest him, depose him, kick him off the throne basically, and then send him into exile. And Rosas still today is fairly well remembered in Argentine kind of political culture. He still has a kind of a personality cult of hardcore followers who remember him as a patriot, who wanted nationhood for Argentina and was trying to make everything equal for everyone, and that the people who were so corrupt that they wouldn't benefit from that, that they're the ones who pushed him out of office. So the general who deposed Rosas basically took power and called for the creation of a new constitution, 53, when that constitution kind of becomes public, and it's very much like the U.S. Constitution in almost every way, except that the capital city, Buenos Aires, would be nationalized. A couple years later, in 1861, the next president in line, Bartolomé Mitre, he became famous for leading a battle basically against rebel forces within the country. So he won that battle and was so famous off of doing that that he was elected president in 1862. And his election in 1862 will start basically about 20 years or so of the Liberal Party keeping power. So he'll run for president a couple more times and lose, but his Liberal Party will largely remain in power even though he loses the presidency in his other two attempts. So his big accomplishment, right when he gets into office, 1862, he is kind of thrown into the involvement in this War of the Triple Alliance, largely because Paraguay was attacking northeastern Argentina, so the president had to kind of do something about this. And he does. He marshals Argentina's forces and launches a counterattack. But in the end, by 1870, it's largely the Brazilian side that will win this war for the so-called Triple Alliance. And he leaves office in 1868, and other leaders will come in the 1870s. The next thing that Argentina is most famous for in the 1870s is launching a series of what textbooks will often call, quote, Indian Wars, end quote, largely to destroy any kind of native tribes out there have been raiding Argentine civilization or Argentine settlements along the border. And in this instance, it's largely the Mapuche raiders that were kind of harassing the government, and the government decided to send in a giant army to stop those attacks. And that conflict grew into a general policy of just conquering the whole southern region in what textbooks even still today call a conquest of the desert. And many historians say that this wasn't so much a conquest as it was genocide against the natives of the area in order to wipe them out and take their land. And one might hope that the Argentine generals that are leading this stuff would be punished for such crimes, but no, that didn't happen. The head general who led these conquest of the desert attacks was actually elected president in 1880, so he'll serve a 6-year term of office. So the main criminals involved in this conquest of the desert, this massive attack on the neighbors, are actually promoted into higher office rather than being punished for their crimes. There's a lot of Argentine people at the time that don't mind the genocide, that they think that natives are like subhuman, or they're not fully evolved or something like that. And even liberals in Argentina will base those types of belief on Herbert Spencer's idea, which is generally called social Darwinism, which is the idea generally that people are in competition with each other and the strongest survive and the weak either are repressed or they die off. So we'll talk more about that idea in I think it's the next lecture on U.S. intervention policies into Latin America in the 1800s. And social Darwinism is a big part of that because it gives some intellectual justification for going in and repressing or controlling or even just wiping out native groups according to their so-called inferior kind of human status. So we'll largely talk about that and other of U.S. imperial policies regarding Latin America in the 1800s next time. So we'll stop here for the day.